first questions that people were wondering about is, is the density different between the islands and between the subspecies? And it might actually sound an easy question to answer. You might think, well, you go into a forest, you count some orangutans, and you do that in a certain area, and you find the density. Problem with orangutans is that their densities are really low. So you might walk for 10 kilometers or 15 kilometers or 20 kilometers and not even see an orangutan. So it's really hard to count real life orangutans. So what people have been doing is to count the nests they make. Orangutans make nests every night when they go to bed, and in some populations they make them quite often during the day. So when you walk through the forest and make a transect and count the nests that orangutans make, and then you can translate that data into actual densities. And over the past 18 years, people have been putting an enormous amount of effort in doing these line transects all throughout Borneo, all the little crosses that I hope you can see, and all throughout Sumatra with the little crosses. Those are all transect sites, and this has really been an enormous amount of work because most of these sites are quite remote. You need to make very long transects, and in some areas you count very few nests, so then the transect needs to be even longer to get enough nests to translate into a density that you can trust. So what do we get after 18 years of data collection? We get an orangutan density on this axis and an elevation here. And what you can see is that the diamonds are the Sumatran densities, and all the crosses are the Bornean densities. And if you draw regression lines through them, you can see that overall densities on Sumatra are higher than on Borneo. And this is true over all the different habitats that orangutans live in. Lowland forest, peat swamp forest, and even higher areas. And what's important to see here also is that orangutans on Sumatra tend to live at higher elevations than the ones on Borneo. So if there's higher densities, you might expect that they're also more social. So what happens if you look at, for instance, female sociality for the three subspecies that we have data for? You can see that on Sumatra, the party size, which is the actual, which is a number of how social they are, is the individual orangutan plus the other orangutans and orangutans with. So you can see that Sumatran orangutans are on average with about 0.6 other orangutans. On Borneo, they're about 1/10 of an orangutan most of the time. So that's what this translates into. It means that on Borneo, they're a lot less social. And that's also the case if you do habitat per habitat comparisons that I didn't do here. So what you see on Sumatra is larger parties of orangutans. This is a bunch of youngsters in Katamba. And it also means that males and females can stay with each other for a longer time. And that's really important, especially for the males, because as you can see, this is the male, and they're a lot bigger than the females. It means they need more energy. And for them, it's really hard to keep up with females if they're traveling. So if food is limited, then it's harder for a male to keep up with a female. And so in Sumatra, you see longer periods of time that males and females spend together when traveling through the forest. So what about the other obvious question, orangutan diet? Orangutans have an extremely diverse diet. Anne Russen has put an enormous amount of effort in collecting the data from all the orangutan research sites, both wild and reintroduced orangutans, and going carefully through all the species names and checking everything, and found that overall in the diet there's about 1,486 plant species, and this is still a minimum. It's a very conservative estimate. So that's a huge variety. Most of it are fruit species. Quite a few of it is leaves, and then there's about more than 200 inner bark species and flowers. And then there's obviously some more that they eat other items from, but they are less common. So if you look at how the diet categories are distributed for the three subspecies that we're looking at, you can see that it's quite similar for fruit. For leaves, there is a bit of a difference with morio. They eat a little bit more leaves. But the main differences are in inner bark, where Sumatran orangutans eat very little inner bark, and the morio and to a certain extent wurmbii eat fewer insects than the orangutans on Sumatra. But although it seems that the means are very similar, what is really important to look at is the variation in diet. And if you look at that, you do see some very interesting differences. Here we plot the monthly percentages of fruit in the diet. On Sumatra, it's almost always nice and steady. Quite a lot of fruit in the diet. Whereas on Borneo, you see a lot of variation. In some months, fruit is really almost all they eat, and in some months, fruit is very rare in their diet. But the means are about the same. If you make a similar graph with the percentage in diet for inner bark, you see that overall the Sumatran orangutans have far fewer bark in their diet, and they hardly ever have a high percentage of bark in their diet. Whereas in Borneo, this varies. For morio, there can be months in which 50% of the time they spend eating, they spend on eating inner bark. And that's going to be really important, because inner bark is not something that's easy to eat. You have to break off the bark or from the tree and then scrape off the inner bark from the pieces that an orangutan takes off. So the actual amount, the actual grams of inner bark an orangutan will get in is very little for all that hard work. This is the result of 2.5 hours of feeding of an orangutan, where she scraped off all this bark from a tree. But actually, in terms of grams of inner bark, will almost have eaten nothing. And on top of that, there's hardly any calories in inner bark. It's about the same as in leaves, but it's much less as in fruits, the non-fig fruits. So obviously, if there are fruits and you need calories, go for the fruits instead of for the inner bark. But fruit might not always be available, so then they have to go for the inner bark. And this has some important implications. As you see, this is how they eat it. They with their teeth, they break off the bark, and they grab it in their arm, and they slowly scrape out the inner bark. And there's different techniques to do this. Not all orangutans do this in the same way. It differs between populations, and also differs between individuals within a population. And even within an individual, you see differences depending on the species they're eating. And that might depend on the hardness of the tree or the size of the tree or other factors that we don't really know at the moment. The inner bark part is really important, we think. And the person that suggested that was Cheryl Mott, and she came up with a theory that was based on what we know from humans, that if you work really hard and you burn a lot of energy, that your energy balance might become negative. And if you have a lot of food, your energy balance will be positive, and especially in females, you will see normal hormone levels and cycles, and in orangutans you see more matings, and you see conception. And she based this on a study from Gunung Palung. On the other hand, when there's very little food around, the energy balance becomes negative, orangutans start losing weight,